Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today's one isn't too serious, when are they ever, but I hope you enjoy it nonetheless. Now, Amazon's most wished for items. If you go on sites like Amazon and you select a category of a product, then you may come across a wish list. These are the most wanted items by consumers who might add them to this list in order to go back and purchase them at a later date. For example, if you're shopping for a TV, you can go to the TV section of the site and chances are there'll be a best sellers category and then the most wished for category. These are the items that people want the most. Now what struck me as interesting was the most wanted in desktop computers, because although the list changes quite a lot, and sure you'll get PCs that feature i9s and GTX 2080s, there's one stubborn system that just keeps making it into the top 5 on Amazon UK. And that system in question, well, it features a processor that may not necessarily come across as one of the most wished for CPUs on the market. And that is this. I sort of messed that line up, let me try again. And that is this, the A10 9700 from AMD. It's a, I don't even know what it is. It's an AMD APU with Radeon R7 graphics. It features 4 CPU compute cores and 6 GPU compute cores, and it's priced, well, not very well. We tested its bigger brother a while ago, the A12 9800, and found that, again, it's not really worth purchasing at the price point it currently sits at. But today I thought we'd take a look at this nonetheless, because it's part of what seems to be one of the most wished for PCs on the Amazon UK site. Remember, this video is just for a bit of fun, and shouldn't be taken too seriously, but the whole most wished for thing struck me as an interesting concept. So the listing itself regarding the PC featuring this isn't dishonest at all. I'm not here to moan about it, it's a pretty fair listing, you know. It says that this PC can run Fortnite and Csgo, which I believe it probably could, but that's something we'll be testing in a little while. And it's priced quite well, at about £300, which is probably why it's in the wish list in the first place, because it's a fairly well priced system. And there's nothing dishonest about it at all. It comes with Windows 10, and all in all, it's got pretty great reviews on it. It looks a little like this. I won't link the actual product in question, but I think it's time to see what the main component inside this thing, the A10 itself, can actually do. How well does it run these games as listed, Fortnite and CSGO? And is it capable of running any AAA releases too? Well, let's get into it and find that information out right after these messages. I'm just joking, we don't do sponsors. So let's unbox this thing quickly. Inside here we have the A10 9700 quad-core processor, and to go alongside it we have the old school AMD Heatsink here, not the ones that you'd find with the Ryzen processors. This is also similar to the one that you'll find with the Athlon 200GE, 220GE and 240GE. It does an okay job. It'll keep this processor at about 34 degrees idle. While the actual system on Amazon uses 8 gigs of DDR4 RAM, I'm using 16 gigs to try and get the most out of the A10 9700. The first thing I did was run the Cinebench R15 test, and while this did take a while to complete, it eventually finished, and as you can imagine, the score wasn't brilliant. This CPU is weaker than the Athlon 200GE, for example, as well as a range of older chips. Now when it comes to video editing, because of the weak CPU performance, this can be quite a struggle. I tested Premiere Pro, and as you can see here, I've got a clip of what is probably the world's most handsome dog, running at 1080p 50fps, and doing anything with this video, cropping it, perhaps adding a few brightness and contrast effects, made the program run slower and slower, and even the full speed video playback didn't work out too well. Furthermore, multitasking isn't really pleasant either. If you've got more than one program open, you're trying to do multiple things at once, this processor doesn't really make it all that enjoyable, to say the least. Things got even worse should I try to render my Premiere Pro video and then browse Chrome too. The CPU just couldn't handle it very well. I don't really expect it to, considering the market it's aimed at, but when you think about the price of this thing, it's priced closely to a Ryzen 3 2200G, and it's more expensive than the 200GE, then that puts things into perspective a little bit. considering I've actually had a better editing experience with the aforementioned Athlon. Now, when it came to games, the first games I was intrigued to test were Csgo and Fortnight, two titles that were advertised as being able to run on this system, although it didn't exactly say how well. CSGO performed quite well at 1080p, albeit with the low in-game settings. However, we were able to achieve at least 60 FPS most of the time. Now, I recorded this video in 30 FPS, a mistake on my part, but I hope you can tell that by looking at the frame rate as well as the CPU and GPU usage in the top right corner, that this game performed okay. I do also apologise for my absolutely terrible CSGO skills. That's something that cannot be avoided no matter what I try. In Fortnite, however, this is where we started to see a couple of problems. Now, I mentioned before I'm using 16 gigs of RAM, but even so I had to turn things down to 720p with the low settings in order to retain at least 30 frames per second. I'm not sure if it's just me, but Fortnite seems to have gotten a lot more demanding recently. Perhaps it's always been like that, it's just the APU I'm using. But nonetheless, there were a few instances where we saw a couple of heavy frame drops, and I think it's not an ideal setup to play Fortnite with. If you're happy with 30 FPS and you don't really mind the settings, then sure, you'll have an okay time, but just keep in mind that for 60 frames per second, well, you're probably going to have to drop that resolution scale even more, if 60 frames per second is even constantly possible. So I decided to move on to some AAA titles, and the first of those was Fallout 4. Perhaps in hindsight it was a little bit silly to try and run this at 1080p, albeit with the low settings, but these are the settings that the game recommended to me with my hardware, so I thought, hey, why not stick with it? Unfortunately, my frustration was taken out on the poor Abernathy's here, who fell victim to the end of my double barrel. This isn't something I'd usually do, but for gameplay testing purposes, I thought let's get into a bit of a combat orientated situation. But as you can see, we weren't able to achieve 30 frames per second, even when we really weren't doing much at 1080p. I think for 30 FPS in Fallout 4, you're going to want 720p resolution. You might get away with 900p resolution with the A10-9700 and the integrated graphics, but at 1080p, the game isn't really playable at all. Now, the newest of today's tested games, Rage 2, didn't really perform all that well in the fact that it never got past this intro screen. This is the screen where you're told to press enter, and doing so meant that this happened. This happened at any resolution with any driver version. It was something I could not get past. Now, Rage 2 does have certain issues with some processors, I believe. Unfortunately, this is just one of those processors that the game doesn't seem to like, or maybe it's the onboard graphics chip. Now, I'm a huge fan of Battlefield 5, so I was determined to get this one running. The first thing I tried was 1080p with the low settings, but the game was having none of it. Next, I tried 900p, and again, a pretty poor result. So 720p it was. Even here, we were only seeing about 23 to 30 frames per second, so I decided that we'd need to take drastic action, and that meant reducing the resolution, the render scale, to 25%. And as you can see, well, Battlefield 5 is pretty much unrecognisable. Good luck spotting enemies when there's about a total of 17 pixels on the screen. However, PUBG, or PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, at 720p ran okay with the low settings. We averaged 30 frames per second, but there were definitely occasions when this frame rate dropped below that. Not to mention when you're about to jump out the plane at the beginning of the game, where the frame rate will range from anywhere between 6 and 18. So just be aware of that. Initially, you may think the game's going to perform worse than it actually does, but once you're on the ground, things will improve a little bit, though there will still be a few stutters here and there. Now, do you remember back in 2009 when you'd come home from school, you'd turn on your PlayStation, Xbox or PC, and you jump into a game of Modern Warfare 2 with your friends? Now, that is something you can relive with the A10-9700 because it's a multiplayer title that runs flawlessly with this APU. These are the sort of games that this thing handles quite well. Games from sort of between 5 and 10 years ago. Call of Duty games have never really been that demanding to run.
perhaps the later ones in the franchise have been a little more system intensive, but older titles like Modern Warfare 2, Modern Warfare 3, Black Ops, etc. have always been pretty easy on hardware. Here, Modern Warfare 2 runs at a solid 60 FPS most of the time, despite the recording here, and unfortunately my skills have let down this video once again. I used to be really good at this, I promise, a really good quick scoper. I can't believe I said that, and I just can't play it anymore. Luckily, the lobbies are still full, you can still get into a game pretty easily on PC, so Modern Warfare 2 is still a decent one to play with the A10-9700. So there we have it, thank you for watching. Now the A10-9700 can be found in one of Amazon's most wished for PCs. In terms of how good it is, well, the answer is not very, but in a lot of older titles or esports games, it should do okay if you turn the settings down a little bit. And considering you can find it in some pretty cheap PCs, well, it's not all bad, though anything with an Athlon 200 GE inside it would be the better purchase. And with all that said, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like on this video, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.